Hello and welcome back to the AP US History curriculum. In this set of videos, we're going to be looking at the fifth time period covered in APUSH, which covers the years 1844 through 1877. You will notice that the early part of this time period overlaps with the end of the last one, so some of the information and events from the last era are still quite important to this one. The key concepts for this era focus on U.S. expansionism, acquiring new territories and migration to them, along with the deepening divisions primarily over slavery that this causes, ultimately resulting in the Civil War. The key concepts also focus on how the Civil War solved the issues of slavery and secession, but failed to address some of the issues about the power of the federal government and of the rights of the citizens. In Unit 6, the topics we will look at include Manifest Destiny, the Mexican-American War, the Compromise of 1850, sectional conflict, including regional differences, the failure of compromise, the election of 1860 and secession, military conflict during the Civil War, government policies over the course of the war, Reconstruction, and the failure of Reconstruction. So in this first video, we will be looking at topic 5.2, Manifest Destiny and the expansion of the United States, culminating in the desire of Americans to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and even beyond, so that they could pursue a variety of economic opportunities. We will also look at the migration of Americans into the West and what helped it, as well as some of its effects. So let's go and get to it. Westward expansion had been a goal of Americans since before the country was actually founded, from the colonists moving to America in the first place to the desire to go beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The Ohio River Valley was one of the first areas subject to American expansion, but it was quickly followed by the Louisiana Purchase territory in 1803. Then there was the acquisition of Florida, as well as some expansion in the areas of the Great Lakes, and of course the interest in the Oregon Territory thanks to the explorations by Lewis and Clark. In 1845, a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan addressed America's claim to the West, saying, quote, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us." End quote. In effect, he'd given this concept a name, manifest destiny, and it essentially means that the U.S. should possess all of the continent and that it was their God-given right to do so. But this isn't the only reason why they should. Americans also wanted and needed access to the natural resources of the region. They wanted California for its port cities, which could open up trade to the Pacific, and the discovery of gold in 1848 only strengthened the desire to head there. People would rush to the area to stake a claim in hopes of becoming rich, but the ones who tended to make the most money were actually the ones who sold supplies and services to the miners, rather than the miners themselves. More gold and silver discoveries followed in places like Nevada, Colorado, and even back in the Dakotas, prompting even more to head into this western wilderness, which of course often put Americans into conflict with the native peoples who already lived there. Mining towns popped up quickly, with many of them eventually being abandoned when the precious metals ran out or became too difficult or expensive to reach. The West also represented a place of refuge. The Mormons, a religious group established during the Second Great Awakening, had faced tremendous discrimination and hostility, so they left the U.S. entirely and entered Mexican territory, eventually settling along the banks of the Great Salt Lake, where they felt they could worship in peace. Of course, just a few years later, that land was acquired by the U.S. as part of the Mexican Cession, but they continued to live their lives, mostly without U.S. government interference. Southerners also desired westward expansion, as cash crops were depleting their soils along the eastern coast, and they desired Texas for its cotton-growing regions, at least in the eastern part of Texas, and many also sought grazing area for cattle, and the more arid grasslands in the western part of Texas were perfect for that. Many had actually settled in Texas while it still belonged to Mexico, since Mexico was looking for more settlers to come to their northern areas in the wake of their independence from Spain. Eventually, though, Texas declared its independence from Mexico and was later annexed by the United States. But we're going to talk more about that in a future video. As the Civil War drew to a close, ranchers in the southern part of Texas were encouraged to bring their cattle northward to railroad centers established in places like Abilene, Kansas, and other towns, so that the cattle that these Texans were raising could fetch higher prices than selling them locally, because the more distant cities where populations were increasing no longer could sustain themselves with only local supplies. But conveniently, you had railroad lines that connected these distant locations to the larger cities of the East. Heading west also appealed to those looking for just new farmland in general. The federal government had long offered cheap land to anyone who wanted it, in the 1840s passing a law known as the Preemption Law, which would sell land for as little as $1.25 an acre. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which would offer free land to settlers, provided they improved it and worked it for a period of 5 years. While millions of acres of land were settled using these laws, the size of these farms involved were often actually too small to truly succeed, given how little rain occurred in many of these areas in a typical year. This area wasn't like the relatively well-watered eastern farms. These were semi-arid grasslands, and because of this, many people failed. And when their farms failed, that meant they failed to get the title to the land. So the government could take it back over, and they could try again, offering it to new individuals. Land could also be purchased from railroad companies, who themselves had been granted large amounts of land on which to build their rail lines. And they could then sell any excess land to recoup the cost of building the railroads. This land, though it was more expensive than government-granted land, was more desirable because it was usually in better locations, but also you have the advantage of the railroad is right there, and you needed the railroad for transporting any crops that you grew and for any supplies that you might need. You didn't have to wait for it to come to you. It was already there. Speaking of the railroads, they would actually prove to be another significant factor in promoting westward expansion, since the railroads sped up the time it took both people and goods to travel long distances. Although many lines had been built in the East, none extended into the frontier. But Congress saw an advantage in funding railroads and authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad line stretching from Omaha to Sacramento, connecting existing lines. 2 companies would build this main line, and the 2 met and eventually drove a ceremonial golden spike to connect the 2 halves of the nation. This event occurring on May 10, 1869, near Promontory Point, Utah, just north of the Great Salt Lake. More east-west lines, as well as connecting lines, eventually followed. And finally, there's the desire to go even beyond the edge of the Pacific Ocean and head into the ocean itself looking for more opportunities. Especially as European nations, Britain in particular, were already doing this, and the United States definitely didn't want to be left behind. This could try and justify its actions based on the idea that they were promoting democracy and Republican idealism, but really, mostly, it was about economic opportunities. The United States had introduced sleek, fast sailing vessels called clipper ships for carrying small amounts of very valuable cargo. Clipper ship had actually set a sailing speed record and held it for about 100 years, so having access to these very speedy ships could dramatically increase communication and trade across the Pacific. The U.S. actually began funding an expedition in the late 1830s called the Exploring Expedition, looking for good trading harbors as well as focusing on scientific research around the world, but in particular around the Pacific. In the 1850s, Commodore Matthew C. Perry journeyed to Japan, effectively forcing the Japanese government to open their port city to foreign trade, or potentially face attack by Perry and his ships. And in 1867, Secretary of State William Seward negotiated a purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire, which actually earned him quite a bit of criticism at the time. They called it Seward's Folly, at least until gold was discovered in the region. But that part won't happen in this time period. That'll happen in the 1890s. And eventually, Hawaii also became an ideal spot, first used as a coaling station once the military began shifting over to the use of steam-powered ships, and then later generating even more interest and economic relationship with Hawaii. But we'll talk more about them in a later time period. Still, that should give you a pretty good idea about topic 5.2, Manifest Destiny, with some of the causes and effects of this U.S. westward expansion. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I will catch you next time.